There's an island in the Mediterranean where ancient towers, ancient structures outnumber the local villages and cities, and I think there's over 7,000 of them total. These are stone megalithic structures and towers, and between these towers, there's hundreds, maybe even thousands of tombs. And guess what the locals call them? The tombs of the giants. The locals have called these tombs the tombs of the giants for centuries. Why? Well, I sat down with a man who claims to know the answer to that. His name, Timothy Alberino. Timothy Alberino is a field researcher. He's not a desk guy. The information that you're about to hear in this interview, he actually verified firsthand. He went to these specific locations, he talked to the specific people, and he got the story that many researchers are scared to gather. Because he spent years on the ground in some of the most remote archaeological sites on the planet. And what he did in Sardinia is something that most researchers, like I said, they won't do. He actually went village to village and he interviewed these elderly people who have been digging in that soil their entire lives. And what they told him proves everything. You see, some of these people were in their 80s, 90s, and one man was even over 100 years old. And they all told him the same thing, the same story. They found oversized remains in the ground and somebody always came and took them away in the middle of the night. And when I say oversized remains, I mean the bones of giants. That's right, real giants. There are places in this interview where Timothy Alberino goes further than most researchers will. And the excavation site that he's talking about and the places he's talking about are real. They're documented. And in fact, the UNESCO World Heritage Foundation lists all of these sites that Timothy's talking about as a World Heritage site. So when you have many witnesses like this coming together, telling the exact same story from different perspectives, in my opinion, you don't discount that. You don't compare it to the official narrative and say, well, the official narrative says that you are wrong. Your story isn't real because the official narrative says it isn't. No, you listen to these people's stories, you hear what they have to say, and you don't blindly rely on the hierarchy of information that our mainstream society tells us that institutions win, people's personal testimonies they lose. I don't believe that for a second. So, the interview that you are about to watch right now, I filmed it in 2025 with Timothy Alberino. We sat down and we had a very lengthy conversation about the giants, about the bones of giants, and about Sardinia. Here's Timothy Alberino.
An ordinary Nephilim is one of the most dangerous beings in all of creation.
Do you believe in UFOs, astral projections, mental telepathy, ESP, clairvoyance, telekinetic movement?
Voodoo and satanic ritual stuff, the bowels of the beast.
Everything is connected, that it's all part of the same subject.
It's all connected.
The secrecy surrounding giants is kind of baffling to me. On one hand, you can understand why conventional archaeologists would keep it secret because it just blows their theories to pieces. We know that Colonel Powell, for example, who's I believe the first director of the Smithsonian, he knew about the existence of the giants that were being discovered in the mountains of America because he wrote a letter to his friend. And in the letter he said that they cannot yet talk about the giants until they can determine where they came from. And the reason why the origin of the giants was so important to Powell is because Powell was an isolationist. And the Smithsonian Institute the doctrine is isolationist, the doctrine of isolationism. And the doctrine of isolationism propounds that all of these various cultures around the world developed independent of each other. In other words, there was no contact across the seas. Nobody was coming from over the sea. There wasn't cross-pollination from other cultures. In other words, the ancient Egyptians weren't cross-pollinating with anyone in the Americas. Everyone developed totally independent of each other. These are the pillars of modern archaeology and the conventional historical narrative. Isolationism. That's a problem. If you're finding red-haired giants all over the world, obviously these guys are migrating from over the sea. And they're coming from somewhere, and that somewhere happens to be the Middle East. And probably Sardinia as well. Most likely, I think Sardinia is the hub. Was the hub of post-flood giants. So Powell didn't want to talk about the giants because it wrecked his theory of isolationism. So there's that, right? But the argument is made sometimes that, well, they don't want to talk about giants because it proves the biblical narrative. Okay, that's a very weak argument, though, because giants don't just prove the biblical narrative, they prove all the myths of all the different ancient cultures around the world. I mean, everybody's got myths of giants, so it's not exclusive to the biblical narrative. There's something else going on, especially if the Vatican's involved in the cover-up. Why would the Vatican want to suppress evidence that the biblical narrative is true? Why would they be interested in that? That doesn't make any sense. You think that they would be eager to present this evidence to the world and say, see, here's more evidence that the Bible is true, being Christians, right, as they are. So what is the reason? Why is this topic of giants so taboo? And why has there been what I believe is a historical and systematic cover-up of the existence of giants? Why? Well, the only thing that makes sense to me is that the occult is involved here, that the mystery schools are at the center of this, that the bodies of giants are being used in a very specific way, that there's a purpose, and that they don't want people to know, for whatever reason, they don't want people to know about the existence of these giants because there's something about them that's deeply entrenched, that's deeply intertwined with the mystery schools.
It's part of a ritual involving black magic.
Black magic.
Black magic only works on the rookie.
I mean, are they using the bodies for ritualistic purposes? Probably. Are they worshiping? Are they venerating these bodies? Probably. Are they harvesting genetic material from them? Probably. That's a much better explanation than, well, they don't want to prove the Bible is true. I think that it's a much more plausible explanation that they're harvesting something from the bodies. They have a use, they have a function. And whatever that use and function is, they don't want anybody to know about it. There's probably a black market that exists for these relics related to giants and other things as well, relics related in general to the antediluvian world. And oddities in general. I mean, out of place artifacts, rather. I know there's a black market for that. So, I suspect it's something to do with the occult. I suspect that the cover-up of giants, the primary reason, has much more to do with the mystery schools. And everybody knows that Abraham Lincoln...
407 years ago, I had a funny hat.
I would say knew that the bodies of giants were being discovered in the mountains. He references it. That ancient race of giants, I'm paraphrasing, whose remains can still be found in the mountains of America, something along those lines. Abraham Lincoln, that was a definitive statement by Honest Abe. And so I don't think there's any doubt whatsoever that the bodies of giants were being discovered in the mountains of America, just like they were being discovered all over Sardinia. I think in some sense, and I illustrate this in the film I made about this, Holocaust of Giants, that in my film Holocaust of Giants, I draw a correlation between Sardinia, the situation that was happening in Sardinia in the 19th and early 20th century, and the situation that was happening in the United States, namely with the Smithsonian cover-up of the remains of giants that were being discovered in the mountains and elsewhere in the 19th and early 20th centuries. So I think there's a very interesting correlation there. Both America and Sardinia, for whatever reason, both of these areas were littered with the bones of giants.
Don't you guys remember?
Don't you guys remember? It's
This website, WikiLeaks, and who is
Hillary Clinton?
Hillary Clinton drank the blood of children?
I'm pretty sure it was Gilgamesh.
Gilgamesh.
Do you guys remember that?
We know that in the Podesta emails that were leaked, there was an email in there that was associated with Hillary Clinton in which she was conveying an interest in the body of Gilgamesh. So I think that that's anecdotal, but I think that the occult, members of the occult, and I think that Hillary is a member of the occult, have an interest in the bodies of giants. I think there's something very nefarious happening. I do believe that the late Tom Horn once related to me a very interesting story in which, and he's talked about it publicly as well, but he told me the details of this story while I was staying with him at his house in Crane, Missouri, and he told me that he had obtained images from the invasion of Iraq, specifically from an operation that was happening at the museum in Baghdad, the History Museum in Baghdad. And the images depicted specifically some very large sarcophagi that were being removed from the museum and loaded up into Chinook helicopters. And that after Tom had downloaded these images on his computer, shortly thereafter, his house burned to the ground. And he lost everything, including those images, but he lost everything else. So he had a very substantial library that he had lost among all of his personal affects. So it's plausible that part of what we were doing in Iraq, part of the operation was to recover the bodies of giants, the remains of giants that we knew were being kept in the museum in Baghdad. And I think we did go and recover. I have no reason to doubt Tom's story. I think we did recover those bodies. I have no doubt that the bodies and bones of giants have been secreted away to the Smithsonian repositories and remain there to this day.
It's this cult where they initiate new members by making them do rituals and stuff.
Tell me, what do you do with the bones?
What's with the bones?
I translated those pages, and they were all to do with summoning demons, okay?
They're pure evil.
The pure evil.
Is it possible, and I'm just thinking out loud here, is it possible that you can utilize the cadavers of giants to summon the spirits of the giants, i.e. the demons? We're talking about the disembodied spirits of the giants that are wandering the earth as disembodied vagabonds, the possessing spirits. Is this the interest that the occult has in these bodies? Is this why they want the remains of giants? Can you somehow use these remains in an occult ritual and occult practices to summon or control or even use them to as a mechanism through which you can become possessed or other people can become possessed with the spirits of these deceased giants? Maybe that's the interest here. Maybe that's why no one is allowed to talk about the giants.
What did he just say?
Did he just say what I think he said?
It's a factory for demon possession, I think.
This mummy is one of the Nephilim, the fallen ones.
So let's consider the fact that the Catholic Church, that the Church of Rome, has commandeered the most sacred sites all around the Western world, all of the most important ancient temples and sacred sites. This was a process that was practiced by the Church of Rome called synchronization. And synchronization, basically, what synchronization meant was if you and I are conquistadors, and with the conquistadors came the priests, and the conquistadors were loyal to either the King of Spain or the King of Portugal, but also to the Pope of Rome. So they had this dual loyalty to their king and country, but also to the Holy See and to the pontiff, to the Pope. And so wherever they went, they were conquering for the king and in the name of God for the Catholic Church, for the Church of Rome, in the name of the Pope. So part of this process was to identify the most important temples and palaces of the cultures in Central and South America, and in fact all over the world, wherever the Church of Rome was dominant, and to, in some cases, demolish those temples and rebuild on top of them, and in almost every case rebuild a church or cathedral or a convent, or to simply repurpose the temple and modify it, such as is the case in Cusco with Santo Domingo. Santo Domingo, they didn't completely demolish the Coricancha because you still have the ruins of the Coricancha on the premises today. They demolished part of it and they erected the cathedral and convent of Santo Domingo. So this is synchronization. The reason why they do this, it's a show of force. It's like planting your flag on the most important sacred sites of your enemy. But then also it's a way of amalgamating the old religious practices, the old cult practices of the native people into the new established religion that is being established by the conquerors, and that being Catholicism. So where once the natives used to come to this site to worship their various gods, now they come to the site to take Mass, to take communion, and become subjugated to the Church of Rome. That's synchronization. And some of the practices of the various religions of these native people, such as the Inca in Peru, such as the Aztec in Central America, were incorporated into Catholicism, into that particular brand of Catholicism. For example, Catholicism in Central and South America has its own brand in comparison to Europe. There's some differences. There are some traditions that you'll find in Central and South America, Catholic traditions, which are distinct from those in Europe, because they're amalgamations of some of the old religious practices of the natives. And this is called synchronization. And synchronization is very useful if you want to quickly convert the native populace to Catholicism. You use the practice of synchronization, you occupy their holy sites, you build your temples on their holy sites, and you synchronize the religion of the Church of Rome, which is Roman Christianity, with the religions of the native populace. Of course, the population is forcibly converted and ultimately has to submit to the catechism of the church, but with some leeway so that they could continue to incorporate some of their traditional practices. So as a result of synchronization, there's many places around the world where you once had pagan temples. Today you have Catholic cathedrals, Catholic churches, Catholic convents, and so forth. Well, what that translates to is a wealth of knowledge and treasure that has been accrued over the centuries by the Catholic Church. Not just treasure, but knowledge. So many of the artifacts that were in the temples fell into the hands of the Roman Catholic Church and probably made their way, if they were important enough, would have made their way to Rome and ended up in the vaults beneath the Vatican. But most of that material would have been destroyed by the priests, such as the codices of the Maya, right? That there are many thousands of Mayan documents, codices, were destroyed by the Catholic Church. So all of that knowledge was just lost in this effort to forcibly convert the population. The same can be said in Peru. Many artifacts were destroyed. If they were of gold and silver, they would have been melted down and melted into bars and then shipped off to Spain. There was something called the Royal Fifth. A fifth of all the treasure that was discovered by the conquistadors had to go to the crown. So that was always being shipped back across the ocean. The Royal Fifth was constantly, there was a constant transit of gold and silver and other sort of precious metals and artifacts going over the ocean back to the King of Portugal or the King of Spain. Yeah, I think, yeah. So I think that if in the process of, let's say Peru, for example, the conquest of Peru, where the native populations are being incrementally conquered by the Spaniards, as they move through their sacred places, as they move through their temples, they're collecting artifacts. They're collecting knowledge. And that knowledge, and in some cases those artifacts, were probably related to the antediluvian world. And I would say, in some cases, definitely related to the antediluvian world, and specifically to giants.
The Nephilim, the mighty giants.
Alien cover-ups, UFOs, Nephilim, conspiracies.
An ordinary Nephilim is one of the most dangerous beings in all of creation.
It's pure evil.
It's evil, sick, despicable.
In Peru, there are records, many records, that come out of the chronicles of the conquest of Peru. So in other words, from the very same documents that we derive the history of Peru. You know, Prescott wrote his famous the Conquest of Peru, which is a phenomenal tome. I mean, it's a wonderful read. He derived all of that historical information from the chronicles, which are today kept in the library, in a library in Lima, but they've also been digitized, so you can search them, especially if you're a historian, you have access to that library. And I interfaced with a Peruvian historian. His last name was De la Vega, in Puno. I met with this, and he's a very well-known historian. He specializes in history of the Inca, in the Inca Empire. And I sat down with him, and I wanted to know if he had ever encountered any evidence of giants in Peru. And he said, well, I know that there's legends of giants in Peru, but I'm not aware of any historical evidence of giants in Peru. And so we met in a coffee shop, and I interviewed him in this coffee shop, and we went our separate ways after that. Well, the following morning, De La Vega shows up at my hotel. And he walks into the lobby, and he's got a big smile on his face, and he's holding a disc in his hand, a CD. And he hands it to me. And he said, you know, yesterday after our discussion, you got me thinking about this, if there's any historical records of giants. So he said, I went into the digital files of the chronicles that we have access to as historians in Peru, and I did a search. I queried anything related to giants or unusual skeletons, skeletal remains that were discovered during the conquest. And he said, I could not believe how many instances I was able to find related to giants in the historical documentation. He said, here's some of them. He said, this is not even all of them. These are just the ones I was able to find last night. I highlighted them for you in these documents on the CD, the digital files. So I reviewed those files later on, and there were dozens from different chroniclers, from the 1500s to the 1600s, I think even up into the 1700s. Different historical accounts from the archives in Lima of the remains of giants being discovered in Peru. And they were not ambiguous. These are not instances in which the remains of giant sloths or dinosaurs can be confused with giants. So they're not ambiguous. We found a large, femur that we think belonged to an ancient race of giants. It's not that. It's not that at all. It's very specific accounts in which clearly the cadavers, the skeletal remains of gigantic humanoids were discovered. So I have no doubt that during the conquest and as a result of the conquest, the Church of Rome, the Vatican, has accrued not only artifacts related to the antediluvian world, but a lot of knowledge. And because of my experience in Sardinia, and because of some of the things that I was told in Sardinia, I believe that the Vatican is in possession of skeletal remains, in some cases mummified cadavers of giants. And when I say giants, I'm not talking 7 foot tall. I'm talking 9, 10, 11, 12, all the way up to 15 foot tall. I have no doubt, because the conquistadors were finding them in Peru, and in recent history, the residents of Sardinia were finding them all over Sardinia. I interviewed dozens of people in Sardinia who dug up the bones of giants. And we're talking about skeletal remains that were intact with clothing and jewelry, rings on the fingers, necklaces around the necks. You know, and last I've checked, dinosaurs and giant sloths and mammoths didn't wear jewelry. They didn't wear bling. So, in some cases, I was told that there were particular priests who were directing the villagers in Sardinia to bring them any remains that they had of giants. And in some of those cases, the remains were burned. In other cases, they were sequestered away. To where? Who knows? While I was in Sardinia, I interviewed 2 individuals. And both of these individuals were hired to excavate in an official capacity in this particular site that had to do with neurologic ruins. And the neurologic culture is a very ancient, mysterious culture that once existed in Sardinia. I think it was a Bronze Age culture. And very mysterious culture, very interesting. But what's even more interesting is that where were they excavating? Of course, beneath the church, or on the premises of the Catholic Church. There was a small cathedral there called the Cathedral of Anastasia in the province of Sadara. And you can go there to this day, and I was in the Church of Anastasia, and you can see where the excavations took place on the grounds of the church and beneath the church. And this demonstrates the sort of archaeological treasure, the knowledge that the Catholic Church, just because they occupied these sites, were able to secretly accrue over the centuries. In this case, both of these gentlemen were involved in the excavation and retrieval of not only the bones of giants, but entire skeletons and cadavers of giants, some of which were very well preserved. And these bodies were 8, 9, 10 foot tall. Both of these guys, at different periods of time, they excavated numerous cadavers at the same site. And when they would find these body parts or entire skeletal remains of giants or cadavers of giants, the procedure was everything that they found, everything that they were excavating, because they weren't there looking for the bodies of giants, at least that they weren't told that. They were told to excavate the site, to excavate the artifacts. And it wasn't just these 2 individuals, there was a group of people, and they were working in shifts. And the protocol was any artifacts or skeletal remains that were excavated from the site were to be placed inside of the church. So they're excavating the neurologic ruins on the grounds of the cathedral, and then taking all of the artifacts and placing them in the church. Now, this excavation was being overseen, in part at least, by the University of Cagliari, or a university in Cagliari. And Cagliari is the capital city in Sardinia. Sardinia, of course, is a province of Italy. And I believe there was some oversight also from the Catholic Church. I mean, it was their property. So there's going to be oversight from the Catholic Church. So it must have been some sort of a collaboration between the university at Cagliari and the Catholic Church. Again, this being property of the Catholic Church. So all of these artifacts are going into the church. In fact, there were so many artifacts being excavated, including the bodies and bones of giants. And then after all of these artifacts would be placed into the church during the day, during the excavation, overnight, both of these guys told me this, overnight somebody would come and take them all away. So these guys would return to the excavation site in the morning to the Church of Anastasia, open the doors, and it's empty. Everything was secreted away at nighttime, all of it. They were collecting so many artifacts that they were running out of space in the church, And one of these individuals I interviewed, he decided to go talk to the guy that was in charge of the excavation or overseeing it. And he sat down in his office and he said, we need a bigger space. Is there somewhere else that we can put these artifacts and these humanoid remains that we're finding? Is there somewhere else? I mean, is there another warehouse where we just have too much stuff and we're having to pile stuff up in there and we don't want to ruin the artifacts? And this individual looked at him and he leaned over to him and he said, "Mind your effing business."
How rude.
He said, "This is none of your business. Mind your effing business and go back to work." So he didn't say effing, obviously. He said the F word in Italian. And so this conveyed to the guy who was interviewing that they didn't want them to interfere at all. Just do your job. And they were told, by the way, not to talk about the artifacts that they were excavating. So it was sort of a hostile environment. He told me, this particular individual, again, there were two guys. He told me that one time he was excavating at Anastasia and he uncovered a huge skull. And the vertebrae was still attached. So the backbone, the vertebrae was still attached. He said it was so large, his wife was excavating at the site with him on this particular day, that it took him and his wife together to carry it. And he said he was holding the skull like this, right? So it's not like this, it's holding the skull like this. And his wife is walking behind him holding the vertebrae. And they carried the skull and the vertebrae into the Church of Anastasia and laid it on the table. Of course, the next morning, gone. Then he said they were excavating a chamber in a nuraghi, which is those stone towers at the same site at Anastasia, and the tower was sealed from the outside, and they had to break into it. And when they broke into the tower, and this kind of contradicts what I was saying earlier, by the way, that the towers weren't necessarily built for giants. They break into the tower, and he said that they discovered that there was a very well-preserved, gigantic person, dead, deceased, sitting at a table. And he must have been 9 feet tall, he told me, sitting at a table, and the table was very large, and all of the utensils on the table were overly large. So the cup was really large, the plate was really big, overly big, right? Unusually large. And he said that the oysters that he was eating were still preserved on the dish. Like you could still see the oysters and the shells. And so that room had been hermetically sealed. And it was preserved. And he said this was like a cadaver. It wasn't like a skeleton. It was like a person who had been deceased for a long time, but preserved like in a coffin. Again, because it must have been buried rapidly, right? And sealed this person in there and killed them, probably suffocated them. And he said it was like 9 or 10 foot tall, he estimated the size. And a bunch of guys carefully removed this gigantic person, deceased, and laid him in the church. And one time he communicated, one of these individuals, I can't remember which one, communicated to one of the professors who would come and sometimes oversee the excavation from the University of Cagliari. And they told the professor, we're finding some bodies here, and sometimes they're too large to put in the church, right? There's not enough room. There's no table large enough to lay them out on. What do we do with these large bodies? And it was always communicated, we're talking 8, 9, 10 foot tall. That's the size range, 8, 9, 10. And the professor told him, lay the bodies out in the yard at the side of the church. Lay them out, and we'll come and deal with them. So he said, he told me, I remember we laid out 3 bodies in a row, and the next day they were gone. So, I mean, these are the experience of the people in Sardinia. This isn't them accounting some secondhand thing. This is their firsthand experience. And these guys would describe, both of them, the rings that they would find were like that big for fingers, right? Everything was giant-sized. And I was able to interview dozens of people in Sardinia, most of them elderly people, who remembered personally having dug up the bones of giants. And in some cases, they were 12 feet long. And it was known. It was known in Sardinia at the time. We're talking about 50s, 60s, 70s, maybe going back to the 40s. And during that time, Sardinia has always been a very rural, rugged land. And it took a long time to modernize. So it was one of the last places in Italy to get modernized. In other words, the plumbing and the electrical and all of that, the building of roads, it took longer than in other places in Europe and Italy. And when they finally got around to modernizing Sardinia, they're building roads and digging trenches and digging for foundations of buildings, they were finding a lot of artifacts related to giants. Bones and hands, for example. When I say artifacts, I'm talking about like a hand of a giant sitting there with a ring on it. And this was so common that the people understood that if they were plowing in their fields or digging foundations for their houses or exploring around the Nuraghi Towers, that they might find the bones of giants. And if they did, there was a very strong possibility they would find jewelry on the hands or around the necks. And so they're always looking out for this because obviously this is treasure. They would be able to sell these things. And they would often find them. In one case, I interviewed a man who was, I think he was 101 years old. But I interviewed him, and he was a very jovial fellow. And very sharp for being, I think he was 101 years old. I think he was 101. Might have been 100, but I think he was 101 years old. He died not that long after the interview. Very, very sharp, though, for a guy 100 plus years old. And he told me the most extraordinary story. He told me that when he was a young man, he needed money, and so he went and hired himself out to a guy from the village that had a vineyard. And he and a bunch of other guys were out there working in the vineyard, and they were tilling the ground in the vineyard. And as they were tilling the ground, and this was a vineyard that was going to be newly planted, right? So the person in the village had acquired this property, and he was going to till the earth to plant a vineyard. And as these guys, the workforce is out there, including this individual I interviewed, as they're out there tilling the earth, they were starting to uncover bones. And this, by the way, was in the vicinity of a Nuraghi, of one of these megalithic towers. So the Nuraghi's here, and the vineyard's next to the Nuraghi, and there's a dozen guys or so out there tilling the ground in preparation for the plantation of the grapes, and they're starting to dig up the bones of giants. And they're all sort of, they're surprised. And they excavate the bodies. They don't pull them out yet. They just dig them out. And they realized that they had a bunch of bodies of giants, 9 foot long, 9 foot long. And the bodies were all arranged in a crisscross pattern like this. And I think they determined it was north-south. I can't recall. It was either east-west or north-south. But they were all in a crisscross position, all aligned. And there were multiple bodies that were positioned like this. These are the skeletal remains, the cadavers of giants, right? And the owner of the vineyard said, "Stop. This is a problem. I'm going to get in trouble. We have to be careful." And he notified the authorities so that because it's bodies, right? You have to call the coroner. So he notifies the authorities, and he tells them that they're unusually large bodies, right? That they're discovering in his vineyard, and they don't touch them. He doesn't want to get in trouble. I mean, this is like a crime scene or something, right? And what happens is he tells his workers, "Hey, I've just been informed the authorities are coming, and they want everyone to vacate the field. Nobody is allowed to be around here. You guys have to leave. You have to go." So they had to cut their workday short. And this old fellow that I was interviewing, telling me this story, he said, "Well, I really needed the money. And I couldn't afford to just work a half day. I needed to work a full day. So I decided I'm just going to stick around and keep working so that I can go collect a full day's wage at the end of the day." He decided to disregard what the owner of the vineyard, his employer, had said. So he's there working, because he wants to collect his paycheck at the end of the day for a full day's work. And he said suddenly a bunch of vans pulled up. And I think he said something like 3 vans, like big vans or buses or something, pull up, and all these people get out. And he didn't know where they were from, but they looked very official. And he hid himself because they came into the field and they were measuring the bodies, they were taking pictures of the bodies, and then they were carefully stowing them away into the vehicles. And they were going into the tower. He watched as they went into the Nuragi Tower, and they were inspecting the tower. And he said they removed a part of the tower, and they found a tunnel, and they sealed it up. And he watched all of this operation take place. And then he watched them load up the bodies, and then they left. And he had witnessed the entire thing. And this guy's 100 years old. He has no reason to lie to me about this. He's 100 years old. And he had other experiences besides that, but those were some of the most remarkable ones. He was digging one time. This will connect to what we were talking about earlier. One time he was digging, and again, 100 years old. He's a young man, so this is sometime in the early 20th century. He was digging for the foundation of a house, just as a laborer, right? And he and some guys are digging with shovels, and they hit something hard, and they realized it was this large, I think it was a stone coffin. It had a stone lid on it. And they uncovered it, and they pushed the lid off, the lid of the coffin, and he said there was an enormous body inside, and it was draped in black cloth. So it had been wearing some sort of a black robe or dress, and you could still, the cloth was deteriorated, but it was still there. And the body was, it looked like if you were to open a casket, but it was ancient, and he said it was enormous. It was a gigantic body. And he said inside the coffin, and this was very interesting, he said inside of the coffin, there were coins, Roman coins. And the coins had the inscription and the likeness of Antonius Pius, the Roman emperor. And so you have a body of a giant and coins that date that body to the time of the Roman emperor Antonius Pius. And Antonius Pius was emperor in Rome in the mid-2nd century. So you have coins that date this gigantic body. He didn't tell me how large the body was, but he said it was enormous. But the really interesting part is that he told the local priest about the body. And he told the priest, who was, for whatever reason, was in charge of this construction. Maybe it was, maybe they were building foundations or digging out for foundations of a church or something. I don't recall the details, but the priest told him to break the bodies up and throw them into the foundation. He said, break up those bones and throw them into the foundation. And then he had him give him all of the Roman coins. So break the bodies up, get rid of the bones of this giant person, and give me the coins. That's pretty much how. And he was laughing about it when he told me. So that was very interesting. I heard dozens of stories like this, dozens of stories where people are plowing in their fields and they're uncovering skulls that are this big in Sardinia in the 20th century. And I'm fortunate that I was able to talk to a lot of these elderly people who are surely deceased today, like that gentleman who was 100 years old, but others who were in their 80s, some in their 90s. And it was common knowledge. And if you talk to the younger people, they would say, oh yeah, my grandparents used to tell me that they would find bodies of hands of giants, gigantic fingers with rings on them, or that they knew that those things were being found in Sardinia. Not only do you have the Nuragi towers, megalithic towers in Sardinia, you also have what are called to this day the tombs of the giants. And the tombs of the giants in Sardinia are megalithic tombs. And they're shaped, I did a film on all this, by the way, when I was working with Steve Quayle at Gen 6 Productions. We produced a film where we feature all these testimonies that I'm telling you. And the film is called Holocaust of Giants, and you can probably still find it somewhere. But at the time, when I was investigating these tombs, I thought that they were shaped in the form of a bull's head. And this is what I say in the film. They're shaped in the form of a bull's head. And indeed, they look like a bull's head. So if you can imagine like a sort of an oval shape followed by like curved horns, right? So it's a shape that sort of looks like a bull's head. But it occurred to me later that they're not shaped like a bull's head. They're shaped like a womb. They're shaped like a womb. And specifically, they're shaped like a uterus with the fallopian tubes. So you can imagine both, like a bull's head, but I think more accurately, a uterus. And why were these tombs shaped like a uterus? Well, the answer is because they were used specifically for a particular rite of passage by the Nuragic people. And the rite of passage is referred to today as the rite of incubation. The rite of incubation. And so you can imagine why they would shape the tomb like a uterus, because there were young people incubating. In other words, it was like a birth was going to happen. It was a rite of passage, like a rebirth, like a new birth. And the purpose of the ritual was that these young people would go into the tomb, because in these tombs, there's a few different kinds of tombs in Sardinia, but what they all have in common is a gallery. They have this internal gallery, and then they have like imagine the shape of the uterus, which looks like the bull's head with the fallopian tubes coming out, and then the gallery is inside of this megalithic tomb. And there's a little doorway. Sometimes there's like a stele, like a large stone with a little doorway cut into it. It's almost like a little doggy door, right? And then sometimes there's a trilithon door. It's actually megalithic stones. And it's a trilithon door, but with a small doorway to where you have to stoop down to get into it. But the stele doorways, like the little doggy doors, are very small, so that only very young people could get into them. Like we're talking, teens or preteens. Whatever the coming of age was to the Nuragic people, obviously these guys were pretty young. These boys were pretty young, probably in their early teens. And the rite of incubation involved either one or multiple of these young people crawling into the tomb through the opening. And these tombs, in my opinion, at least some of them, were likely mounds. They were likely covered with earth. So they would have looked like a mound. And the young person would crawl into the tomb, and then the tomb would be sealed for a certain amount of time, and that young person would incubate in the tomb. Now, there's probably a couple things going on here. Probably there may be psychedelic substances involved in this. I don't know if that's the case or not. But what I do know is that they're not just in there incubating in a tomb to communicate with their ancestors. They incubate in the tomb to communicate specifically with the mighty ones who are buried beneath the tomb. They're there to communicate with the spirits of dead Nephilim, dead Rephaim, who are buried beneath the tombs, not in the tombs, beneath the tombs. And a lot of archaeologists today will scoff at the notion that the tombs of the giants were built for giants. Well, in one sense, they're correct. The tombs of the giants weren't built to house the bodies of the giants, although they are big enough to do so. I measured them myself. The giants were buried beneath the tombs so that the galleries were built on top, and the young people could go in and incubate with the spirit of the giant. These things were potentially factories for demon possession. I mean, that's one way to look at it. You go into the tomb, you get possessed by a spirit of a Nephilim, the spirit of a dead giant, which are the possessing spirits according to the scriptures, and you come out demonized. Or it could be that you're just trying to communicate with your mighty ancestors, the giants, and somehow be imbued with their prowess, their power, their strength and capability in battle, and so forth. But very interesting. The tombs of the giants, megalithic tombs, were built for the rite of incubation, and they're shaped like uteruses. People don't realize that there were more megaliths in Sardinia than any other place in the world that we know of so far. There were over 30,000 megalithic Nuragi towers on the island. 30,000. And of course, the conventional explanation is that these towers served a defensive purpose. In other words, they were built like castles, but there's just way too many of them. 30,000 on one island. And I'm convinced that the towers and the tombs are related. In fact, you can usually find tombs of giants in the vicinity of towers. The towers and the tombs are related, and I think they're both related to communication with the giants, with the Rephaim, with the Nephilim that are buried in the soils of Sardinia. But also the towers clearly have an astronomical purpose. So there's something very interesting, an interesting relationship between the megalithic tombs and the megalithic towers. I believe that this ancient Nuragic culture was actually the root culture of the Canaanites and of the Canaanitish peoples that were inhabiting the Levant, the Promised Land, during the conquest by Joshua and the Hebrews. I think that this was a stronghold. Sardinia, the island of Sardinia, was a stronghold of the offspring of the Watchers, of the descendants of the Nephilim in the post-flood world. And that they had migrated to the Levant from Sardinia and probably migrated back to Sardinia after the conquest, or during the conquest, some of them at least, of Canaan. But it's clear that the Nuragic civilization, this ancient mysterious civilization, the roots of it are Canaanitish. There's a lot of similarities between the Nuragic culture, the ancient Nuragic culture, and the ancient Canaanites. And it's known that the Phoenicians also inhabited the island of Sardinia, and the Phoenicians were Canaanites. And so it's very possible that the island of Sardinia, that was the origin of the Phoenicians themselves. Because again, the Phoenicians were Canaanites. So it might have been the origin of the Canaanites who migrated to the shores of the Levant a long time ago, and then had established themselves before Joshua entered the Promised Land and drove most of them out. Not all of them, but most of them. The island of Sardinia is a part of Italy. It's located off of the western coast of Rome, and it's below Corsica. So you have mainland Italy here, and then you have Corsica, and then you have Sardinia. And Sardinia has been traditionally a very rugged and difficult place to keep under control. The Romans had a hard time. They used it, they mined Sardinia, but they were mostly occupying the coastal regions. The Sardinian people have always been very difficult to subdue. And I think, the heritage of the Sardinia people, we know today, many of the modern Sardinians are actually related to the Phoenicians. They have Phoenician genetic markers. That's why in Sardinia today you'll find quite a lot of people with red hair. Red hair is one of the genetic traits of the Sardinians.
So there he was. That's Timothy Alberino. And here's what I can't shake about this whole story that he's telling. It's not the bones themselves necessarily. It's the pattern. The pattern itself is, let's just say, undeniable. You have Sardinia, you have the mounds in Ohio, and you have thousands of different reports all over the world of people digging up giant bones. Most of them are detailed in this book here. This is not a plug, by the way. This is just a book that it goes into detail, and it shows you the news articles themselves, different periodicals, different news articles, and different journals that detailed discoveries of giant bones and giant artifacts that were hidden. So there's thousands of them. You can find them. Now, the thing is that mainstream archaeology, mainstream academia as a whole will discount all of these for a number of reasons. One, they're going to say that, well, giants don't exist, so even looking into this is foolish, okay? So that's obviously misguided. And then two, they'll say that all these stories, all these reports, thousands of them from all around the world, they're all made up. They're made up to make money. They're going to say that these newspaper reports, all of them, 100% of them, are just yellow journalism. They're a way that these newspapers would print false information in order to, sell copies, basically. But the thing that they don't take into account is it's not just newspapers. It's not just a few newspapers around the country that are jumping on the bandwagon. No, it's a lot bigger than that. It's periodicals. It's journals. It's research papers. These are accomplished people who are writing about the bones that were found and the artifacts that were found with the bones all over the world, different countries, different cultures, all telling the same exact story. And these stories are the same all across the world, right? You have a team of people, or it's either a team of people that are excavating a certain specific site, archaeologists or whatever, or it's just regular people who are sometimes farming, like Timothy said, and coming up with these bones, the bones that are just under the surface. So every case when a bone is found, or a series of bones are found, where a discovery is made, every single case, somebody shows up and poof, it's gone. It just disappears. And when the person who made the discovery tries to inquire about what happened to the bones, what happens? You probably know. Nothing. Nothing happens. They're going to say, what bones? We never collected any giant bones. I don't know what you're talking about, sir. And the fact that the Smithsonian's first director, John Wesley Powell, wrote the policy, he wrote this exact policy in 1879, that it literally killed the conversation. He said, okay, and mind you, this is policy. He said that anything suggesting contact between the oceans before Christopher Columbus arrived, it's inadmissible. It's false. Ignore it. This paper became doctrine, and the bones that were being pulled from the mounds during that exact period of time, these are the ones that kept getting sent to the Smithsonian. So we have the official doctrine of the Smithsonian saying that if you find any evidence of contact between people across the oceans before Christopher Columbus, discard it. Hide it. Bury it. This is official, people. They don't want people realizing that there was a civilization on North America long before Christopher Columbus ever arrived. It's even proven now that the Vikings came here. If the Vikings could come here, don't you think that the Phoenicians can, who were like the world's greatest sailors? I think they definitely can. And there's even reports of Egyptian artifacts and monuments and even bodies, maybe, being pulled from a cave inside the Grand Canyon. All right? So time and time again, this happens. A discovery is made. An official shows up, the discovery is taken away, never to be heard from again. And then you have Abraham Lincoln. And this is in his own handwriting, people, preserved by the Library of Congress. Look at it. It's on the screen right here. And he wrote this exact quote: "The eyes of that species of extinct giants, whose bones filled the mounds of America, have gazed on Niagara as ours do now." End quote. Guys, this is huge. Think about this. The President of the United States, Abraham Lincoln, he wrote about the giants. He was writing about them like everybody knew about them, like it was common knowledge, because it was common knowledge at the time. In the 1850s, it was certainly common knowledge that giants were not only real, but they were being discovered all across America and taken to the Smithsonian. But I want to know what you think, right? What do you think about this interview? What do you think about Tim's stories, about the testimonies, about the people that he interviewed? What do you think about the giants themselves? Are you new to this whole subject? Have you known about the giants, or is this the first time you're hearing that giants are real? Put it in the comments below. I'm curious to hear what you have to say about this. I'm curious to hear your opinions. So, and if you haven't hit that like button, please do so. And we'll see you guys next time. Thank you for watching, and God bless you all.